Hey, welcome to another painting class with Paige. Tonight we're going to be painting apple blossoms, and I hope that you're excited for this class. I know I am. So before we get started, first and foremost, if you want to paint along with me, you can get all the imagery down below in the description. So where you're viewing this video, just look down below and there is a link to both the reference image and the sketch image that you can trace. I will bring those up here for you. So one will look like this that you can trace or transfer to your paper. The other looks like this and is our reference image for tonight's painting. So go ahead and click down below and check that out and get that downloaded and drawn. And while you're doing that, I'll take care of some business tonight. If you're new here, my name is Paige. I'm the Chief Pixel Pusher and Paintbrusher over at Gumption, and I'm enjoying being in quarantine because I get to paint here with you guys. This is a class where you should feel comfortable painting at your own speed with me, and if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. Also, if you're tuning in tonight and you're able to get into chat, say hello. If you look to, I believe, below the video where the video is playing and you scroll down a little bit, it'll say comment, and you can put a comment in there and say hello. Okay, so let's get to our colors before we get too carried away here. These are the supplies that I'm using tonight. I'm going to be using green colors. You can mix a green color with a yellow and a blue if you don't have a convenience green, as they call it. I will also be using opera, alizarin crimson, or quinacridone magenta. These are all reds and pink colors, so any kind of color that you have that is pink, you can use that. I prefer opera for a great color, but I'll be probably darkening it with another red. So use what you have. You don't have to have these colors. These are just what I'm using. You can improvise. Also, I'll be using Sodalite, which pretty much looks like Payne's Gray. It's just a different color space there. But if you have Payne's Gray, that's great. If you have a darker color, I wouldn't necessarily recommend black, but maybe something darker, like a dark brown or something, will work just fine. And finally, we'll be using ultramarine blue. Sorry for all the dinging and clicking here. We'll be using a blue for some of the shadows in our apple blossom. So if you have an ultramarine blue or any blue will do, we'll be using that as well. What else do I need to tell you before we get started? This class should take about an hour. Sometimes they go a little over, but I think we're going to have some fun tonight, so plan for about an hour. And if you have any questions, feel free to throw them in the chat, and please let me know that you're here so I can say hello to you. And without further ado, I think we can get started. There are a couple things that I wanted to tell you about, so we'll switch our views here. Okay, so this is the sheet that I use to transfer this, and I just use pencil to transfer. But one thing I would like you to note, and you may have already drawn this in your picture, no harm, no foul, but I decided to leave this leaf out because I felt like when I was looking at this painting that I did, it was a little bit, I just didn't love it in there. So I'm leaving this one out of my painting tonight. I think I'm going to like it a little bit more. Also, another thing to note is if you look at this leaf here, I did not draw in this side for your download sheet, so you'll just want to connect that line there to finish out that petal. Okay, and you can see this is what we're shooting to paint tonight. We're gonna do our best, and we're gonna have fun doing it. So all right, so we'll get to mixing some paint here, and in this view you have a view of the palette here, so you can kind of see how I'm mixing and what I'm mixing for paint. First, I'm gonna mix up a green, And I'm going to use sap green here. Actually, we'll just move over to this view so you can kind of see. I'm using a pipette. This is a pipette. Let's see if I can get it under here. This is a pipette, and so I use this to add additional water sometimes if I need to. And if you're having trouble hearing me or things are like freezing, let me know. We had a little bit of issue earlier today, and I'm trying to get to the bottom of it. I was thinking maybe it was our internet today, but you just never know. So you see this color? This is a real pretty color of green. And I'm going to try to put a little more pigment in here. We're going to be working wet and wet tonight. So I'm going to mix up some of the sap green. I'm also going to mix up some of my pink. And we aren't applying this just yet because we're going to do a wet and wet technique. And before I get started, I wet my paint, so often I'll use a pipette, or if I have a spray bottle that's got quite a bit of water in it, I'll spray them down. Okay, let's see if we'll switch into this view here, and if this does any better. I'm getting some messages on my end that I might be having trouble with my stream. So hopefully that will improve there. Okay, so first we're going to do a wet and wet technique, and what that means is I'm going to wet my brush with water and I'm going to draw along the outside of this flower. We're going to do a diffused background for this, and this is the way to do it, is wet and wet. I may add a little bit of soda light into one of these little areas here just in case I want to add some soda light. So quickly, I'm gonna kind of get my reference photo out. Not that you have to follow the reference photo for this background, but you can see I have a pretty pointy brush here, and it gets into all those nooks and crannies. And so I'm just gonna go all the way around here. Sometimes it's hard to see where your water's going, so you can lift up your paper and kind of see where it's at. Couple of things I also need to mention. We'll be using a resist crayon tonight, so if you have a white crayon in your arsenal of art supplies, you'll want to grab that. If you don't have one, that's okay. I'm going to teach you a little bit about a resist crayon tonight, and you can find them in your local hobby store or art store generally, but often a white crayon will work just fine. So I'm going all the way around the edge and into the little areas. This is the background that we're painting. And sometimes you just got to check and see how wet stuff is because it dries pretty quickly here in Idaho. These are actually apple blossoms from my in-laws. They have an orchard here, and we got to go spend some time with them for Mother's Day last weekend, and got to hang out in the orchard, and you could just hear the bees humming away, doing their work, and there were all kinds of bees out there. So this is, these are some Idaho apple blossoms. Okay, so I'm gonna kind of go on the outside here, make sure it's really pretty good and wet. I can see areas that have dried already. So I'm just going to have to keep working faster with more water here. Okay, I think we're pretty good and wet. So now I'm dipping my brush in my green paint here, and I'm just going to drop it in and let it go. There might be some areas that you'll want to darken, so that's where the soda light can come in, but I'm just going to get in here into some of these tight spaces and just watch that paint go. This is what's so special about watercolor, is the way it spreads. And there are some watercolor paints that are a little bit more spreadable than others, so to speak. I am using Core watercolors here, and they do a great job of spreading. Okay, so I might go into some areas here with a little more of this green, see what happens. Definitely want to get maybe in here. Some of your areas may dry a little, have dried a little bit. Now I'm going to drop some pink in here. I'm going to try to kind of keep this background light. Felt like in my demo painting it was a little bit of a competition, maybe. So if you get a drop like this, pretty much it's going to spread, but if you don't like how the blob has landed, you can move it around. I love this color combination. It's just something so pretty about it. And maybe I'll drop in a couple drops of soda light in some areas here and see if we can get it to spread. You might have to clean up some edges, and that just means kind of going around them there. And when you're at a spot where you're kind of pleased with what you're doing, you can stop and let this dry. Now would be a good time to use a hair dryer if you want to dry it. I am going to kind of keep working and see if I can work in some other areas and get things rolling. Okay, so one thing that I do want to talk to you about is the resist crayon. So what's great about a crayon or a resist crayon, this is what it looks like, it's clear, is that when you put this on your paper, it actually repels water, which means it's going to preserve your white paper and deflect paint. So we're going to play with this tonight, and if you don't have one, don't worry. You can just leave the really white areas alone and don't paint in those areas, and you'll have that light area. So we're going to take a look here at our reference photo. I'm going to zoom in here. So when we look at this picture, you can pinpoint the areas that are getting light because they're white, but you can also, and this is an area where you can run your crayon where it will deflect and preserve your paper. So you can see all these little areas where they're white. So here on our paper, we're going to use the crayon and use a reference photo to see where those areas of white are. Then we're going to take the crayon and color in those areas that are white. And we'll go all around the flowers and blossoms and color this in with our resist crayon. If you color with your resist crayon over your pencil, it will keep that pencil in place. I don't think there's a problem with pencil marks in watercolor, but if you are a person who doesn't like that, you might want to lighten those pencil marks first. And here I'm just going along and finding those areas. It is a little hard to see because it's clear, so you kind of just have to do your best and move around your picture. And now I'm doing the center of the flower. Just trying to get these little portions of the flower drawn in to preserve their little stem areas. That looks good. I think we can start to paint. So here I'm going to add a little bit more water to my palette and mix up some ultramarine blue, just a little ultramarine blue. So mixing it with water, then I'm going to dilute it down a little bit more so it's a little bit lighter for our petals, because they are in shadow, but they aren't an intense blue. And so here I'm testing this blue to see if that's going to work for me, and it looks okay. I recommend using a secondary piece of paper if you need to test a color before you commit to it on your watercolor painting. So here I'm using a small round brush. This might be a 4 or a 5 brush. And I'm going to paint in the petals. And I'm showing you here, this is a blue color for the shadow. Oftentimes you have warm light, cool shadows, especially on a sunny day. So we're going to start painting that in with this blue. Okay, so we're using a very muted light blue for these shadows, and I'm just going to kind of go petal by petal, and I can see here that most of this one is in shadow, and because I've used my resist crayon, you can see it's resisting in this area. Kind of see here and along the edge. I can even tap a little extra blue in here because it's a little more in shadow down there. Maybe I'll drag it all over this petal. And then I'm just going to keep moving around to each petal and kind of assess. This one, I believe I went around it with a resist crayon. Along that side, it looks like. So this is just a really watered down ultramarine, and then I'm going to go in with a little bit more color and tap it in here. You can kind of see how it's blooming out. See if we can zoom in a little bit more. And it has kind of, I'm just actually going to tap this around in there, and then I'll go back maybe and put in a curve when that is a little bit dry, because there's a shadow that comes here. It also creates some depth with that petal, and it is probably another step to do, and that's okay. And I can see that I was pretty good about putting down my resist crayon, so I'm just going to follow this line here. You might hear my cat in the background. She's meowing. She wants to be let in. You gotta love her. She's pretty forceful, but she's kind of pushy. Okay. So this next petal, I'm gonna use this blue again, but it's got some light on it and it's got some pink in it. So I'm gonna kind of go along this area here. It's got some dark up here. I know I've used the resist crayon on this probably too. I'm going to soften this top edge just a little. So I've wiped my brush off. I'm just kind of going over the top there. And next I'm going to dip into my pink, if you look over here at the webcam, and kind of water it down just a hair. So we just have a touch of pink here. And of course, red and blue make a purple color, so this might kind of mix a little into a purple. I can see where I've used the resist crayon here. Just kind of bring that in. And then we'll hit these petals up at the top. Scoot this down a little. We can zoom out a little. So I also use the resist crayon up here. My paint's looking a little purpley, but wherever it can kind of hang out, then we'll let it hang out there. This one's pretty white as well, and I know I have resist there. It looks like I got into some pink. Let's go back into the blue. There's kind of a shadow here that I can see. I'm gonna hit this little guy over there. Dip it into the pink a little bit. We might come back to this petal too, just to get us rolling with some pink. It's along this edge here. Okay. So everything has an opportunity to dry as we're kind of moving around. And we might just move into the pink right now because that's looking like what's left next to our leaves. So we'll start down at this one. This has some pretty good color here. So I'm using Opera Pink. You could use quinacridone magenta or a red if you like. We've got some darker area down here, so I'm just tapping in some paint and letting it spread. I might actually mix a little quinacridone magenta over here. You can see I'm mixing it on the palette there. It's a pretty good color. I'm going to grab a little smaller brush. You can see it's quite a bit smaller, and I'm just going to do the same thing. I'm going to tap. You could even dip your brush in your pigment to get a little more pigmented. And watch that go. So I'm going to water this down a bit. Get a little more opera, and we're going to kind of work our way around this little blossom, painting in these more vibrant pink areas. And what you can do by doing this, I can shape this white area here by painting this pink area. So this is a little teeny petal right here. I can just sort of paint around. If I need to dip it into water to water it down a little bit, I can do that. There's a bit of a shadow here, so I might come in with a little bit different tone. But I'm going to keep moving around to each petal. So this guy, you can see has a petal that kind of goes in like this. You can define the other edges here of the things around it. And you're really just drawing with your paintbrush. So I'm going to paint in this area. I'm going to add some more vibrant paint. These are pretty pink. And because there's paint that's down there, it'll kind of flow a little bit more. Grabbing some quinacridone magenta here. Just kind of tapping it in there. And while I still have pigment here, I'm going to you could even go in with a red color here. I'm going to maybe use a little alizarin crimson. We'll see what that does. And just some of these areas that have a little more shading or dark areas. Okay, moving on to our next petal back here. And I left this background pretty muted. You can always go back into your background and make changes there. But I really want the vibrancy of these petals and these blossoms to really stand out. Okay, what am I missing over here? So I have some more petals on this other side. This one in the back kind of wraps around. It's a pretty light one, and I have a little too much water there. So I wiped off my brush and I'm kind of moving this pigment around here. Let's see. Okay. And then I'm going to go underneath here. So there's this bottom petal. It's got quite a vibrant color in there, so I'm going to add some of this quinacridone magenta. You can add a little more concentrated paint of your pink or red paint too. It could be the same color as what you're working with, just more pigment. Kind of. This is my opera color. I'm going to lighten this area just a little. These apple blossoms are so pretty. My in-laws have an orchard at their home, and so we got to visit the other couple weekends ago, and they're just blooming like crazy. Okay, so this little guy, it's hard to see him a little bit because my pencil is pretty light here, but he's pretty round. We've got a little bit of pink in the background. A little here. It's part of a bud, I think. And this guy's pretty dark at the bottom. We'll see if this moves a lot. Just going to tap in some quinacridone magenta. And now I can kind of move around to the other petals where we might need lighter areas here, or there's a bit of a shadow, so I might add a little bit of blue in there because they're drying. So it's kind of spreading a little bit. Just some real subtle color. You could even add a little touch of a yellow or a warm kind of yellow there if you want. Soften this edge. Okay, so while certain things are drying, we're going to go in with some green and start working on the green areas. So in between the petals here, there is green, and this is a sap green that I'm using right now. You could use a green gold color. Just kind of defining this area in between. And this is a lighter shade of green than you'll see on the outer leaves because it's sort of being hit by sun a little bit. I know I have some resist crayon in here somewhere, and you'll kind of want to mind your, I think these are called pestils, the little parts in between. In the middle of the flower. I'll find out where exactly my, excuse me, my green areas are here. It just kind of helps separate this guy. So this is pretty watered down pigment. We may have to go back in with a little deeper, with a little bit more pigment or a darker color. You can mix green with yellow and blue. You don't actually have to have a convenience green. I'm using sap green here. But the possibilities are endless that you can mix your own color. I'm going to add a little extra pigment here. Right here. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. I'm going to go along this guy and add this bottom part of the petal. This one is pretty light, and my paint is in, you know, it's pretty dark there. You can always lighten it. So I've dipped my brush in water. I take it with a paper towel kind of wipe it off. And then you can kind of lift paint if you think you need to. You can always go back into your background and make this area darker if you need to make these other areas stand out a little bit more. It's entirely up to you. And I see behind this petal there's a green leaf. It's hard to kind of see it back there, so we're gonna just draw it in with our brush. And this is pretty light color, but I'll go back in once I've laid down this paint. I can go in with a little more pigment and drop it in there. So you can see that there is a little leaf there. And we're kind of round robining. I'm just trying to get some of these little green areas painted in, and then we'll go into the greater leaf. But by defining these areas a little bit, we can suss out this image a little easier. And these bases of the petals here, they're pretty light. So if you have to lift a little bit of pigment to get this light green, then that's good. Okay. So I'm going to start working on this guy. And overall, I'm just going to put down some sap green all over the leaf. And just spread that bead around, that bead of paint. Kind of clean up your edges there if you need to. And then we'll go back in with another layer here. You could do this too now. You could drop in darker paint and have it spread a little, a darker green color like that, and just spread it across, or you can just have the nice, I'm just going to let this dry this way, and then I'm going to go back in. So I'm going to do this in other areas too. This leaf. Too. And we have some light hitting this guy. So I'm wiping off my brush here and pulling out the pigment. And then I'm going to take this dry brush and run it along the back, and that will help keep this light area. Maybe I can drop a little bit of pigment in here. I'll definitely hit it again. And just kind of work my way around these petals. Now I always put my hand down and then I put it down in paint. So if you have to scoot your paper around, which I'm going to do it. I've got kind of a couple of leaves here. I'm just going to color it all the same color. Don't worry, it's not going to blend into the background too badly, because we're going to come back. I have to draw in this leaf back behind here. Okay. We're just going to keep moving around. And I left out this leaf because I didn't think it added necessarily to this picture. So I'm going to do this guy here, same thing. All one color here. Maybe a little more pigment in here. We want to make sure that we preserve this base of this flower because it is lighter than the leaf. And then we have this weird area back here where part of this branch is. And I think we can go in there with a different color, like maybe a sodalite color, just to fill in this gap here. Just so it doesn't look like there's a gaping hole in there. So my green is it's drying right now. We'll go back into that. I think that we can go back into the petals if we need to add some more depth to them, this one in particular. So I've just dipped my, whoops, that's too much water. Okay, so back into my blue. I can just draw in this area that's a little bit darker. And you can see it's really subtle, but it can be really nice. We'll zoom in a little so you can kind of see. I might add a little bit of sodalite to this blue. Tap it on my paper towel so I don't get a big blob. Might need more. And just lightly direct traffic for this guy. Give him a little depth. Some of these you can see just and by adding this dark color around these lighter colors where we had the resist, it makes that light stand out a little bit more. I could even put a little more shadow in here. To give these a little bit more depth. And this one has a lot more shadow along the side. And you can just kind of build your petals this way. This one kind of goes to the edge and there's quite a bit of pink in here, some subtle pink. So I'm going to tap into my opera a little bit. Just put a little bit of it there. Of course, there's a little bit of resist in there, so it is repelling the pigment. I could add a little bit of pink around these areas maybe. And kind of round robin these guys again. And just look where you have shadows, and you could do this all wet and wet too. I've talked about how I enjoy the layering process. And this guy's kind of fun because he has some little veins here that you can see. And I really enjoy that subtlety of using a light pigment and building on it. I'm kind of breaking into this one a little bit. With this color, this is a bit of Sodalite. Let that dry. And if you need to keep moving in to areas, then so be it. Okay. So what I'm going to do next is I'm actually going to get a little bit of this yellow. I think I'm going to use a yellow ochre. You can use any yellow that you have. This yellow ochre is this color, and it's kind of a milky yellow, but you could use any other yellow that you like. Just gonna tap it with a little bit of water, tap it on my paper towel, and we'll kind of go into some of these areas to define the center of this flower. Now you probably don't want to get into areas that are wet with other paint or it will spread, but I thought I would tap in here because it will help us sort of define certain areas to continue help defining this flower. I'm going to have some resist there. You can definitely see where you place your resist. Okay, so while all of that is drying, we're going to move back into our leaves because they look pretty dry. I'm going to get a little more pigment here. And I might add a little touch of Sodalite or Payne's Gray to this green to darken it up a little. Ideally, you kind of want less passes when you're painting with a good color the first time. So as you can see, as you're watching me paint here, I'm going along the edge here and I'm moving this bead of paint. And when you move the bead of paint like this and you kind of keep it together, you will have less marks in your painting. It'll be a smooth, it should be a smooth transition. Now, what do you do if you run out of paint? Well, you go to your paint palette and get more paint. And just keep adding it. Don't add water. Add pigment or your mixed paint. And that's why it's good to make sure that you mix enough paint so you don't have to go back in and stop and paint, because then things dry and then you get uneven painting. So you can see this bead is sitting right here, right? Of course that area is going to be a little bit darker, but that is good. We're going to move on to our next area where we need a little darker pigment for these leaves. This one's kind of a funky leaf. It's kind of go around there. So this one I'm going to keep this edge here light. And you can really start seeing the leaf come to life. And you can just slap paint down if you like that loose feel. I really enjoy kind of drawing them out. Okay, so we're good with that leaf. We're going to move on to our next leaf. So this guy up here, I'm going to work on this guy. Now he's got some light shining through this leaf, so keep that in mind. I could have even used a little more yellow in this color for this guy. But I think that's probably good for now. If I want to clean up those edges, maybe I'll come back with a little small brush. Okay, we're going to go hit this guy up here. And the guy behind him is darker, so we're going to start on that guy and shape him. I'm going to switch brushes so I can have a smaller brush to fit in here. It's kind of a small area. It also can help me draw kind of these scalloped edges a little bit better. Just keep moving that pigment. I think I see a little teeny tiny hair in there. Okay. And if I wanted to, this guy here, I can make him even a little darker and scallop him maybe a little bit more back behind. And you can see how nicely this is drying here. I'm going to have this spot because there's that glob of paint there. But we're okay there. You can kind of go in where you need to fix details. I see that this guy scallops up, and I didn't see that before. So I can paint that. Maybe I want to create a little more form shadow here, but I'm going to be really careful not to touch this area. And just add a little bit more so it's less flat looking, because these things are curved. We want them to feel curved. So I might clean up some edges with a small brush. This is a, I don't even know how you say it, 10/1 -1. We have one rogue hair, it looks like, in there. And I might just clean up some of these edges. This is not good here. Along the petals here, so I can you can really discern the petals a little bit better. Now I always feel like you should use the brush for the job. Lots of times we use brushes that are size 6 or 8. This is not a large painting, but if you need to use a small brush to clean up edges or to give a little definition, invest in a little brush. It will make a difference in how your painting looks, I feel. can just get in these tight places that you couldn't normally get into with a big brush without maybe getting water or paint in other areas. So unfortunately my resist kind of went into this outside area, but that's okay. We're okay with that. And like with these tiny brushes, when I look at my reference photo, the leaf has light areas where the veins are, but you can add veins. Just a little bit of pigment to give this a little subtle. If you can see that, that's so tiny. That's why I kind of like these. Just make it kind of fun. There's Harlow the cat. She knows I'm talking about her. And I could even use a darker pigment here. I'm just seeing how subtle I can make it. I may find that I either spill pigment there or need more, which it looks like I need a little bit more. We'll kind of see what that looks like when it dries. I'm also going to go around the edge here to just clean up this edge and define it a little bit, separate it from the background. I hear somebody working. Our neighbors are taking advantage of the quarantine and getting some garden built out back. Okay, so I think that looks pretty good, and since I'm gonna kind of go along and kind of clean up some edges, add some details. Give these leaves a little bit of definition, because you can see here I've lost that definition because this is the same color. So you can either go in and make this a little bit darker, which maybe I should do, so I can kind of show you how to do that. So I'm going to go back into my sap green. I'm going to go along the edge here of the flower, the flower petal, and this leaf, and that helps define that edge. I can kind of continue along here. And then I'm going to soften this, so I dip my brush in water and clean it off a little bit, and then just kind of soften that edge out. And there you go, you've defined that edge, and you can do it that way, or you can use a brush and define that edge too. Now, not everybody does this, but I like this because it gives it a bit more definition, less confusion. So I'm going to go along this edge here too, and some of these petals, and maybe clean up edges, define them a little bit. So I just brought some sodalite in here, and it cleans that edge right up. Okay. So now we'll go back into some of our petals maybe and add a little extra color. And With this little brush, you can do your edges here. Ever battling fur. Just make these guys come alive. And where you think you need to add a little more contrast, you can add a little more pigment. Now you don't need to remove your resist, it will just live on your page. That's what's kind of nice about you using that. So I'm adding more contrast to this guy, a little more pigment, cleaning up this edge here. Yeah, these little brushes are a wonder. Okay. I don't know what my neighbor's doing. Maybe you can't hear that. Building something. And you can keep this as loose or as tight as you want. There's nothing more beautiful than artists who are able to do quick flowers with a couple of brush strokes. So here I'm kind of defining this butt up here. It's got some edges that are a little bit darker in places, and it has a little bit more white in it. And it has some shadow here. Okay. We just have a little more pink in here. And if these two mix, that's fine. It creates this kind of purple color, which is already happening on this blossom. I feel like we need a little more contrast here. So I'm adding this quinacridone magenta. This little guy has some great veins kind of stemming out from it. There, that's what I needed. maybe give him a little, we've got a, you know what I'm going to do is to define that edge, I'm actually going to use some green up here to give my petal some definition there. So I don't have to draw that in. I can just define it with some green. So what I can do here is dip my paintbrush in some water, tap it a little, and then soften this edge. Maybe I want even more green over here. Soften that edge there. And that definitely helps. I might actually do this over on the other side too. Soften that edge. Nice. You can see how that really helps start making this pop a little. So in some of these areas I might even go back in with a little bit more green because I feel like they aren't dark enough, like over here. So I'm just using another layer of sap green. You could use a darker color. This is mixed a little bit with sodalite. And often watercolor dries lighter than it appears when you paint it. I find less of that happening with my core watercolor, but it still happens. So in some of these areas I feel like I need to have more contrast. I'm gonna just do another layer there. I'm kind of pleased with this guy, so I'm going to leave him alone, but may add a little bit of a form shadow here to make him look like he's curling. Soften this edge a little. Maybe do a little bit of pigment here. You may not even notice that. Looking pretty good here. And you can continue to add more contrast if you want, if you need it a little bit darker. In here, now I know I used the crayon in here for these little pieces in the center. But where I can, I think I'm going to try to create a line so you can kind of see it. They'll get kind of lost in there. I also now have an opportunity to define those center parts a little bit more, so I'm going to go in with a little more yellow ochre and get the spots that I missed. And maybe just deepen this color a bit. So we got to use resist. You can use resist in a number of ways if you're trying to give something texture or just keep some areas lighter. That may be all we can do for this one because of the resist in there. I'm just going to fill in some areas here. Draw in some of these edges a little bit. Clean up edges if I can where we have resist. And we're almost done here. But I feel like we would be better served to do one more swipe of our blue color. I need to mix up a little bit more of this kind of shadow color, so I'm dipping into my Sodalite and a bit into my ultramarine blue. So you can see here, this is the color I'm mixing. I'm going to add a little bit of water. And I might just test this to see how dark that is. Maybe kind of go into some of these places. Oh, you can't see that. Let's do this. There we go. Go into some of these places to add a bit of more of dimension. And as you can see, that really does help. But what's nice about doing this in layers is you preserve these lighter areas because they're not going to be solid white. But it really helps, and it gives this a little bit of curve. And like here, I want to add just a little bit more pink. Yeah, that's looking better. Again, I'm going to go in here. And this really helps define the other petals too, when you have one that's more in shadow. Okay. This edge is a little bit darker where this flower is curling. Sometimes you have to kind of keep looking at your reference and figuring that out. Whoops. Let's see. Go in here and also define these center areas. We've got some resist down there. That really helps this guy come alive. What do you think of that? There are some areas that maybe we could define just a hair more in our blossoms. I see one area here that could be painted a little bit darker so it defines this edge. Maybe a little darker so we get this petal a little more defined here. Just kind of fun. Kind of going around and refine. And define. And I think for now, we're done with our apple blossom. How did you feel about this assignment? It's kind of fun to do something that's pretty basic in color, and it's very complementary in color, and see how you can use light colors, diffuse colors to create shadow and light areas. Because when you really look at things, maybe when you're looking at this blossom, you think it's white, but when you really get to looking at it, you can see, oh, wait a minute, there are many colors and there are maybe many different values of blue and shadow. So thanks for tuning in with me and painting along with me today. I enjoyed it and hope that you did too. I want to give a shout out to my Patreon subscriber, Colin Jackson. Thanks for supporting this channel. You help make these videos possible, and I appreciate you guys being here. If you have any questions, feel free to pop them down below. And if you liked this, share it with your buddies and paint along with them too. And if you want to see more of this content, please hit that subscribe button and you can be notified whenever I have new painting tutorials or videos out. Until then, keep painting. I enjoyed our time together and I look forward to seeing you next time.